Good morning, everyone. My name's Ryan Dividock. I'm the supervisor for the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit here in Oakland County. Welcome to today's virtual planners gathering, Backyard Chickens. Just a few reminders. The meeting is being recorded and it'll be made available on our website. If you have questions, please use the chat function in Zoom and direct your questions to Jim Schaefer. Jim's going to moderate the question and answer session after the presentations have completed. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. We have Susie Stec, who's the Planning and Economic Development Director for the Village of Beverly Hills, and Thomas Paison, the Deputy City Planner for the City of Southfield. Thank you both for joining us today. Susie, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for having me. As Ryan said, my name's Susie Stec. I'm the Planning and Economic Development Director for the Village of Beverly Hills. I've only been there for about 2 years. I was previously in Lathrop Village and Clawson and kind of working my way around Oakland town or Oakland County. But so we're actually kind of at the anniversary of the backyard chicken ordeal for me. So, backyard chickens have been actually a really long time coming in Beverly Hills. Next slide, please. So which came first, the chicken or the ordinance? And it's kind of the ordinance. Previously, back when the village was first incorporated, uh, our ordinance said the keeping of farm animals and other animals was essentially prohibited unless you had a non-domesticated, except you had a cat, a dog, a canary, a parakeet, gerbils, hamsters, guinea pigs, turtles, fish, rabbits, and other similar animals. Chickens were prohibited. Farm animals were prohibited, and you had to go to the zoning board of appeals. And so this is the way it stood until last year. Next slide, please. Like I said, the slow roasting of chickens and the backyard chicken issue started long before I got on board with Beverly Hills. It started back in 2017. We had a resident. I'll call her Chicken Lady, which she doesn't know I'm going to call her Chicken Lady, but that's okay. Um, she wanted to keep. She lives at one of the historic homes in Beverly Hills. She's been a lifelong resident, and she really wanted to keep chickens. She wanted to kind of have that lifestyle that would allow her to, you know, grow her own vegetables, tend her own chickens, raise her own, get her own eggs. It was expensive, whatever her reasonings were. So she applied for a use variance from that provision that I cited at the beginning, right? And zoning board listened to her. They said, "Thank you so much for coming and asking for permission, but the answer is unanimously no." And so she's a pretty resilient individual. So she she asked, she was having conversations with administration at the time, and how can I make this happen? What do I need to do? And so, the next year in 2018, council formed this subcommittee, and they had her placed on the subcommittee to start researching and writing a new draft that would take over the keeping of chickens, right? And allow for residents to start keeping chickens. It was a pretty um, I want to say it's a pretty loose subcommittee. I know there was an individual from Planning Commission, there was another individual from Council on there, but it was not to confuse my foul puns, but it was a little loosey-goosey, okay? But one of the things they did, they had a Facebook poll out there. She has her own Facebook page that she runs, and so they put this poll out there, basically Do you like chickens? Do you not like chickens? Are you somewhere in the middle? Let us know, right? And so you can see on the slide, 62% of people that took this poll were in favor of chickens. And there was approximately 400, between 4 and 500 members of on this Facebook group. And so they kept moving forward. I will say, and I don't have a picture of it in here, the level of chicken hate that came out from the residents was pretty substantial as well. There and these signs popped up again in the latest round of chickens. Um, so then in 2018, Chicken Lady also gets elected to serve on council. Like chickens are her platform. Okay. So they keep rolling with the drafting of the chicken ordinance. And in 2020, uh, there's an ordinance that is drafted and presented to council. And they tabled it. They're like, but people can't come and comment, so we're just going to table this. And that's what they did. And that ordinance sat on a shelf doing nothing but collecting dust. Next slide, please. Next slide, Jim. Thanks. So I guess coming home to roost, right? So, like I said, I've been in Beverly Hills now for just over 2 years. I had been on the job for no joke 2 months. I was actually on vacation, which is where I'm at right now. I was on vacation, and I'd heard right before I left, I started hearing little squawks around the office about chickens and tickets and chickens and someone for real threw out secret chicken sleeper cells. I'm not gonna lie, that was a thing we heard in the minutes. And I by the time I came back, um, there was the chicken lady at my counter saying, I'd like to submit a variance application. And I was like, well, is this a use variance? I mean, I barely knew the ordinance at that point in time, right? And oh no, I already tried for that. I need to do something else. I'm like, well, it's not dimensional. So she asked for a zoning interpretation. And I'll admit, I was kind of panicked because, like I said, I didn't really know the ordinance at the time. I was still very new to the community. I didn't know I didn't know the backstory at this point. I just knew that chickens were going to be a thing. And in my previous communities, I didn't have to deal with chickens. They were outside of the zoning ordinance. The standards, at least at the time, were um, minimal as they applied to zoning. The honestly, the only chicken ordinance or instances that I had to deal with was when I worked in the city of Hamtramck, and we had individuals that were regularly seeking locations to do chicken slaughter, which is a completely different kind of animal, if you will. Um, so, anyway, so she files this zoning interpretation, and feathers start flying everywhere. I start getting emails and voicemails, and I got pages of like legal analyses in the mail. Just people are angry. I haven't even sent out notices at this point, right? And in the midst of getting all of these public comments, I also realize ZBA hasn't been trained. There's several new members. They and they're starting to get, and I don't know them either. And they're starting to get a little nervous because, well, some of them have known about the chicken issue, right? And let's be clear, it's not actually about the chickens in Beverly Hills, right? Remember I said Chicken Lady got elected to council? Chicken Lady's still on council, okay? So it's not really about the chickens. I mean, it is and it isn't. So as ZBA is starting to kind of have a little panic attack, I get them a training. I say, all right, let's just do a 101. We've reached out to MAP, was able to get someone from the Michigan Association of Planning as part of their education. Like, please come. We're going to spend a whole meeting. Just talk to us about how to make really good decisions as a zoning board of appeals. I mean, I told our trainer, yes, we have this issue. Please like, don't focus on that though. Like, they really need to understand how to make this really work. Um, so they did, and I think that was probably one of the best things that I could have done for the zoning board of appeals. They had, so in those, after I've sent out those notices, right, had, I probably received close to 30 emails every single week for about a month. Um, Residents were coming to council, and we have two council meetings a month, and residents were showing up at council meetings, and no less than a dozen were speaking at public comment and expressing their extreme anger, frustration, and agitation at this whole situation, right? ZBA meeting comes up. It is a packed house. Like, when have you ever seen ZBAs packed with like 40 people? But there we were. We had a completely full house. Um, it was a very orderly meeting. They spent an enormous amount of time listening to the arguments, to keep chickens and really thoughtfully, going through all of the standards that we had just talked about, um, to come to their decision, which was to reject her, reject Chicken Lady's interpretation that chickens are pets and that she would not be subjected or subject to that ordinance. So, um, Chicken Lady appeals to circuit court, and oh my gosh, the judge voids section 46 199 as being unconstitutionally vague, and he equates chickens to parakeets because, well, they're birds. I'm sorry, what? Residents lose their clucking minds. Oh my gosh, the feathers are all over the place. Right, next slide, please. So, council decides not to, sorry, council decides not to appeal the circuit court decision. And they instead put a moratorium in place and form another subcommittee, this time with two council members and two planning commissioners. Chicken Lady once again participates on the subcommittee, and this time she's a seated council member. So she, and she's not happy with the moratorium anyways. And this is something I would certainly make sure that if you end up going through this process, definitely have your legal counsel part of these conversations. We ended up actually having separate legal counsel just for this backyard chicken issue as it went through the appeals process at circuit court. But I would say if you have special counsel, make sure they're involved. And you kind of have a double set of eyes on moratoriums, right? There was some concerns whether or not they were legal. Um, so anyway, so the subcommittee is not tasked with just chickens. They are tasked with updating all of Chapter 8 animals. As part of this legal process is in the challenge, right? The moratorium's not legal. We also get a legal opinion from Village Council that subcommittee meetings are subject to Open Meetings Act. And so we have three meetings, in-person meetings that are held over the course of last summer. Um, the public continues to flock to these meetings. I mean, no less than a dozen members of the public come to every single meeting. There are comments made each and every time and in between. Um, so we put out another survey, and just to kind of gauge, like, all right, they had a pretty great turnout from the last one. Let's see if thoughts and feelings have changed. It is both a super successful and a complete failure all at once. We had incredible turnout, as you can see on the slide. We had more than 1,300 respondents. Too bad that um, a good chunk of those were actually duplicates. The program we used Microsoft Forms, and we either didn't set it right or it doesn't allow it. But we had residents that were kind of trying to stack the deck, if you will. And they were submitting really ridiculous answers over and over and over again, and it really skewed the results. And so that was another thing that really kind of set people off. So keep your surveys tight, but I will say, holy cat, this was a great response. Okay. And still, people are not, but now people are not interested in chickens, right? And I think part of this shows that, the original survey that came out was done on Facebook with a very limited group. Not all the residents were part of this. This was something that the village put out. It was in our e-newsletter. It was on our website, distributed to all of the different groups that we had and said, hey, please share this among your friends, families, and neighbors. And so, we had a much wider net, if you will, to cast with our survey. So there was, the and we were lucky enough that we had an individual that was able to go through our results and kind of scrub them clean and really help us figure out, were these valid, were these not valid. So that was a really helpful individual to have. And so there was still intense debate over, should we be restricting by lot size? Should we be restricting by the number of permits? Do we care? Do we care about how many chickens we have? Should there be a grandfather clause? Should this even be in the zoning ordinance, or should it just be in the animal ordinance? And so ultimately, the subcommittee prepares two ordinances. For the general code, it's taken completely out of the zoning ordinance. And the ordinance that is presented is, there's an ordinance to allow and there is an ordinance to prohibit. Next slide, please. And so, Colonel's Not So Secret blend. You're allowed to have 4 hens, no roosters or any other type of fowl. You can't get your ducks in a row, nothing loosey-goosey, no roosters, just hens. You can't free range. Your chickens must be kept in a coop or a pen at all times. We did a lot of research. The subcommittee did a lot of research, and we looked at just about every single Oakland County community to see, what do they do. The majority of them don't have this in their zoning ordinance. And these standards line up fairly well with what's common in throughout the county. You can have, so freestanding coops and pens are no more than 80 square feet, 8 feet high. They are subject to the accessory building and applicable zoning standards. So in Beverly Hills, you are only allowed to have 2 accessory buildings, and that includes your attached garage. So if you want chickens, you're either going to have a garage and a chicken coop, or a garage and a shed, or maybe you're going to try and finagle your way into having your coop attached to your garage. And that's really the only kind of wiggle room around that particular element. Um, since residents were really, they had a lot of concerns about noise, smell, um, attracting of other wild animal nuisances, right? Like raccoons and possums, um, rats to some extent, right? So there was a lot of concerns about those animals coming in. So there is a restriction that they have to be 10 feet away from the property line and 30 feet from a principal residential structure on an adjacent lot. They did choose not to restrict by lot size. However, they chose to restrict the number of permits that are issued in a calendar year. So we have 15 permits that are renewed annually. They're non-transferable, and there's an inspection within 30 days of permit issuance to make sure that they conform with the building standards for the coops. Next slide, please. Uh, currently, so there's a picture of one of our first chicken coop, actually. Um, the ordinance went into effect in October. And I know that there was some concern by residents that we were going to have a chicken run on permits, holy cow, and that we were just going to have, a line of people out there. And I think part of that was hindered by the time of year, right? October is maybe not the greatest time to start building a coop. But right now we have 3 permits that are fully issued. Coops are either under construction or have been constructed, as you can see in the picture below. We do have 2 permits that are under review. That is as of last week. Recent amendments were made by council to grant a limited exception for those individuals who were previously keeping chickens and whose flocks exceed the allowable number of hens. The exception is it's a limited grandfathering, right? So the flock will naturally diminish as chicken dinners had. Um, I will say we've had one one formal complaint, and the police department has gone on their first chicken run for escaped chickens that made their way into a neighbor's yard. Next slide, please. So my Dirty Dozen, my grade A lessons, as part of this, uh, don't underestimate the silly seeming topics or issues. This is definitely one residents are incredibly passionate. I wish I had known even before I got her variance application, just how intense this was going to be and how upset residents would be. I ended up pouring through every single set of minutes, Planning Commission and Village Council from 2017 to now to understand just how cuckoo it went. Um, I did find that there were references to secret chicken sleeper cells. That would be secret places, secret chicken coops, essentially. So and all those signs that were out in 2017 and 2018 and 2019, they all got recycled and they came back out for 2025, right? So don't underestimate these issues. They don't sound like much, but they are the ones that really get residents riled up. Encourage and welcome engagement. Get all the good, the bad, the ugly. Um, and along those same lines, be as transparent as possible. Um, I There was a lot of residents that continue to make noise about this, but um, at least from an administrative perspective, I knew that they weren't mad at me. Um, they were definitely mad at that councilwoman. And they're mad at how the whole series of events has transpired, right? And so being able to say, this is exactly what we're doing. And we had, we had a separate page out there on on the village's website where we were putting information. All the packets were out there, everything, right? So there wasn't, we tried to minimize as much as possible the idea that some individuals had that we were keeping information from them. Um, so that was I think one of the best moves that we possibly could have made. One of the worst moves was using Microsoft Forms for surveys. So don't do that. Use SurveyMonkey or some other official separate platform where you can track IP addresses and you can really you can limit your number of submissions, right? Be more thoughtful about it. We had great questions, and while I was thrilled with the data that we did get, it was tainted in a way because it wasn't done right. Um, keep your personal feelings in check. This is for the community and not for you. I have some pretty strong feelings about the whole chicken situation. And I had to remind myself several times to calm the clock down and just remember who this is for. I don't live in Beverly Hills, so this wasn't about it wasn't about how I felt about chickens or how I felt about the situation. It was what the residents wanted. Um, talk to your colleagues and do some R&D. And by R&D, I mean rip off and duplicate. There's so many communities that have already done this. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't rebuild the coop. Talk to your neighboring communities, talk to your colleagues, see what's worked for them, what issues came up. I wish I had talked to Tom. You're going to hear from him next. And I wish I had talked to him, and we probably could have had like breakfast every single day for like 18 months. It would have been awesome. Um, train your boards and commissions. Again, this was probably one of the best things I could have done for the Zoning Board of Appeals. And they loved it so much. Honestly, they keep asking for another training. And when are we going to do this? And it is carried forward into all of their decision making. It's an excellent practice to have it, right? Um, review with your attorney your insurance policies. I kind of fluffed over it, but we did have to hire outside counsel for this. Our village council determined that he had a conflict of interest because technically he would have been defending the village from a suit by a council person. So he recused himself from being part of this case. And so we ended up having to hire an outside attorney to help us navigate the circuit court appeals case. Um, you may have sections that could be determined to be constitutionally vague. The only way you're going to know is if somebody challenges it in court. So be prepared. I was certainly surprised by it, and I know I wasn't the only one. Um, don't overthink your ordinance. You are never going to get everything, never. And you're never going to make everybody happy. So do yourself a favor, keep it simple and keep it easy to enforce. If you're not there tomorrow and code enforcement's not there tomorrow, make sure the next person can read this and easily understand it and say, yep, that's what I got to do. Um, and then it is definitely easy for your council, your board of trustees, whomever it is, kind of lose the forest through the trees. So learn how to engage with them individually and collectively. I like to say keep it light and fluffy at times. You'll be able to figure out a lot and where they stand if you can just have civil conversations with them. But that has kind of been the story of backyard chickens in Beverly Hills. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email and phone number are right there for you. Have a sense of humor about it. That's your 13th little lesson. Have a sense of humor and laugh about it with your colleagues. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Susie. Next, we have Tom with the City of Southfield.
All right, everybody. I'm Tom Paison, Deputy City Planner with the City of Southfield. I worked for the City of Dearborn for 16 years. I was an assistant department head in economic community development, oversaw zoning administration and development review. And then I worked for Colorado Ortman for about 5 or 6 years before that. This is a little bit of an odyssey we also went on, slightly different than Susie's because we didn't have a council person who was advocating it, which is a whole interesting twist. We can get the next slide. All right, just kind of a quick summary. We looked at our kind of goals when we got into this because I like to go to fundamental principles, like what are we trying to accomplish? Because I try to get agreement amongst the policymakers as to what the goals are, so I know what I'm supposed to be writing. And one was to make it feasible for a larger number of residents to keep backyard fallow by reducing the minimum setbacks from neighboring homes into a more typically used standard. We saw recommendations by MSU Extension and what other communities were doing. We actually did allow backyard fallow, but the rules were so restrictive that maybe 5% or less of the lots in Southfield would have qualified. Large lots, mostly on the west side of the city. And then the other thing we had was we had rules in the zoning ordinance and we had rules in the animals ordinance in the general code, and they were mostly consistent, but not entirely consistent. And enforcement was really unclear as to who was supposed to be doing that. So we had a lot of, pointing at other people when enforcement was going on. So what we did was we decided to create clear and consistent enforcement requirements and authority, consolidate to one location for ease of updating the regulations, so you're not trying to update in two different spots. And moving it out of the zoning ordinance got rid of legal nonconforming status. That went away because we moved it out of the zoning ordinance into the animals ordinance completely. To clarify that as well. Get the next slide, please. So our old regulations, your minimum setbacks for the coop and the run from off-site dwelling was 175 feet. And this is what eliminated most lots. You couldn't have any off-site dwellings within 170. It couldn't be within 50 feet of the on-site dwelling. This also made it very difficult. And then 5 feet from the property line. Enforcement authority was unclear. It was split between the code enforcement department and the animal wardens and the police department. And it was really not the clearest. There was no permit or license required. There were no minimum lot sizes. There was no specific coop or run standards, no prohibition on roosters, no cap on numbers of animals, and no feed storage requirements. So the ordinance was restrictive enough that we effectively had none that were legal. But it lacked a lot of, if you were going to reduce those setbacks and make it actually legal, you needed some additional rules. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what an example case, this is one of the folks who had a code enforcement case that kind of got this started. When we applied the existing rules, the current regulations from the 90s, you begin to see like the circles are basically the 175 foot from any additional home, and every home in the area eliminated the entire lot from having chickens. Even though this was a 70 by 300 foot lot, this was a big lot. There was nowhere under the existing regulations they could put a chicken coop. So we determined that to be unreasonable. So we started working on that issue. I mean, this was a half-acre lot, basically. Next slide. So when we looked at the new regulations, we decided that we met with the animal wardens, code enforcement, building department, clerk's office, city attorney. Like we had everybody at the table on these discussions. And the animal wardens, who are very comfortable and well-trained dealing with animals, and particularly our senior animal warden grew up on a farm and was very familiar with chickens and keeping chickens. She was comfortable with having them be the primary, because like if there were neglected or other issues with the animal wardens can actually take the animals. The code enforcement staff can't do that. They're not authorized to do that under law. So the animal wardens have specific training for dealing with animals and animal welfare and specific training. And they're also in communication with the Department of Agriculture at the state level with regard to looking for animal diseases as they come through. So like having them as part of the enforcement meant like if they were aware of chicken coops and they were getting a bird flu alert from the state Department of Agriculture, they could be looking out for signs of that in the community. We did decide to go with a renewable annual permit, a license required through the city clerk with review by the planning and the building department. Because if there were problems, we wanted to be able to like not renew it or revoke that permit. And since we moved it out of zoning, it was no longer like a zoning approval that would run with the land. This was just a permit. For the setbacks of COOP, we reduced the setback for offsite dwellings from 175 to 50 and from the property line to 20 feet. So you had to put this kind of in the middle of your property. You couldn't make it a problem for your neighbors was the idea. We also put in some max coop size, 8-foot height, max 80 square feet. It did need a shed permit from the building department required. Maximum number of fowls 12. Feed storage, we didn't know this, has to be in a sealed vermin resistant container because obviously that is a potential issue. Roosters were prohibited, slaughter was prohibited. So these were, and this is like, we went through planning commission and had meetings about it. We met with staff, we met with the city council at study meetings multiple times. Public hearings were held for the ordinance amendments. It was kind of a long to do. I'll go through a timeline in a minute. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is what it looks like on that same lot, the revised provisions. So you can see with that 50-foot radius from the neighboring homes and the setbacks, it left them an area in the middle of their lot where you definitely could fit a chicken coop and run. But it had to be kind of central in their lot. What we didn't want people doing, this was very clear from council, we didn't want them using like their perimeter fence as part of the coop. They didn't want the chickens on the property line. Put it like, and as I explained this to the applicants and the folks who were interested in this, I said, that way if the chickens are a problem, it's mainly your problem and not your neighbor's problem. And after they understood that like that was the motivation on that, they kind of understood like, well, yeah, they were the ones who wanted to do it. So it was on, the onus was on them. So next slide, please. So this is a little bit of the timeline of our 2-year odyssey that I spent amending this ordinance. Started out in February 21st, 2023. There's a code enforcement case opened on a resident keeping chickens in violation of the provisions of the 1990s era ordinance. They tried to work out a way to get legal, but there was just no way into those rules to get legal. So they came in October of 23 to a city council meeting, a study meeting, and kind of got up during public comment and said, here's our problem. We want to be able to do this, but your old rules make it impossible. Is there a possibility we can look at updating these 1990s rules that are so restrictive? And the directive we got from council was to review that, to look into the 1990 rules, see what a modern standard would be and whether or not they needed updating. So we spent a few months doing research, discussing in-house, meeting with the other departments, looking at what other communities at standard, the MSU extension recommendations for like urban agriculture. And we came up with sort of a framework that we thought might be workable. So in January 24, because there were regulations in the zoning ordinance we were going to have to repeal, we did have a presentation at the Planning Commission study meeting on the issues and the options. Then in February of 24, we went to the legislative subcommittee of the city council, presented those issues and options as well, getting feedback from both bodies. Next slide, please. Then the legislative process got kind of kicked off in full. We took a draft ordinance to the Planning Commission study meeting, repealing the zoning elements, basically just taking those out and adding a reference to the animals ordinance, just saying, hey, if you want to do this, you got to go do the animals ordinance. Had a public hearing. They recommended the zoning ordinance amendment approval. And because they were repealing it from the zoning ordinance, they did look at what was going to be in the general code and did comment on that and make a recommendation as well at council. Draft ordinances were presented at legislative subcommittee of the council. They had some questions and revisions and additional information. So we went back in October with revised ordinances to the legislative subcommittee. The legislative subcommittee at that point referred it to the full council. So we took it to a council study meeting. Council had questions and revisions they wanted addressed. We went through some more iterations of that. Came back to council in January. They had some more concerns and adjustments they wanted. Made those, came back in February with a revised ordinance. And then in February 10th, 2025, we finally got, what we did was we said we want to adopt the new animals ordinance before we repeal the zoning elements so we don't have a gap in coverage on the code. So we adopted the new regulations. Council approved and introduced the ordinance, first reading, February 10th, February 24th, they enacted. And then we had the first reading of the repeal of the zoning provisions. Then those were enacted in March. Next slide. So we got to the point where we had new ordinances. It took us a while. Then we went into implementation period. We had a permit application, a permit application had to be prepared, work with the clerk on that. And since March 2025, when this became effective to present, we've had about 5 permits applied for, 3 have been issued, and 1's been renewed. So not like, as with what Susie was saying, not an avalanche. There wasn't a line out the door. Now we've had a bunch of inquiries, but it turns out like a lot of those folks, when they actually find out what the process is, they start getting the numbers for a chicken coop and a run and all the other expenses related to raising chickens. They find out that it's more expensive than they thought and a lot of work, and they decide not to proceed. The folks who proceed on this, it's more of a lifestyle, as Susie noted with the chicken lady. Like, that's a lifestyle. That's not about saving money. That's about how they want to live. So it's not been an avalanche. We do, 1 or 2 of these a quarter, maybe, where we get it's not even an avalanche of inquiries, really. But in summary, we're talking about, just not including all the staff time, planning commission study meetings 2, planning commission regular meeting 1, legislative subcommittee of the council 3, council study meetings 4, council regular meetings 3, and then staff time and meetings, we lost count. Like, it was beyond calculation. So you will spend a lot of time on this, but you're going to end up with a small volume of folks doing it. And we really haven't had any problems with the permittees. The people who have the permits have not been a problem. We do have some folks still operating outside that system. The animal wardens and code enforcement kind of have to track down and either get them to go legal or get them to cease and desist. Even though we did put out like social media and other announcements of like, there's a program, there's a permit application. When we adopted the ordinance, there was educational materials and information put out, but there's just still folks kind of, in any city the size of Southfield, you're going to have some folks doing their own thing. So we're still working on that. Next slide. What I've got next here. Nope, just the end of the presentation. So that's it. I was telling Susie and Ryan and Jim, I really feel like with that 2-year odyssey, it's almost like we stacked up all the molehills until we made a mountain. Like, it just really, not that it wasn't a useful application, because we actually had a broader discussion about urban agriculture and like how our ordinance deals with like beekeeping and urban gardening. Like, there was a little bit larger discussion on that, and a review of our ordinance on those items as well. We actually did, at the same time we did the backyard follow, we updated allowing beekeeping with certain limited rules. And that's not really been a problem either since we adopted it. And we determined that the urban agriculture, a lot of the other urban agriculture activities were allowed as accessory activities in residential, but we made that a clear interpretation of the ordinance, so we didn't need to amend the code. But it was worth the discussion. So I would say, in the format of having a larger discussion about urban agriculture and agricultural activities, this is a good way to kind of have that overall discussion and kind of get the temperature on that larger issue, and to make sure you don't have any weird things to prevent people from doing basic vegetable gardening. Like, some of the ordinances can be a little weird about that. So, it's like a lot of these issues. Like, it gets started, you get directed to do it, you work your way through it, and eventually you get there. And the way we've consolidated it all into the animal section, in a couple of years, if we find that like, okay, we didn't even need to be that restrictive, we could probably massage that some more. At least I only have to amend one general ordinance section to make that happen. So it's and amending a general ordinance section is much more straightforward than amending a zoning ordinance section. Like, it is a much easier process. It's pretty much like motion action. You don't even really need a public hearing necessarily for a general code ordinance. It has to be done at a public meeting. It has to be published, but it's just a much easier process. And honestly, bringing the animal wardens into the discussion, into the enforcement, really kind of professionalized the approach. We got much better specific advice once we involved those folks. So I recommend, if you're going to move it out of zoning, if you have animal enforcement officers in your community, involve them in the discussion. They're very knowledgeable about the state law related to animals, and generally about the keeping and proper keeping and care of animals, what kind of issues they're going to see with animals in the field. Now, the bulk of their work is still dogs. Like, it's just, that is what they do 95% of the time, is dog related stuff. But they were fine with they were appreciative of being included in the discussions, that they were the ones going to have to deal with some of the enforcement issues when it came up. I would say loop them in, loop in your city attorney. And one of the things I've learned over the comment on Susie, like the circuit court judge determining that was unconstitutional provision. Circuit court judges get overturned on appeal about 65% of the time. So just you never know what's going to happen at circuit court. Because, like, can you imagine if you were wrong 65% of the time and still have your job? So I've seen that one in my career. Like almost every time we've appealed a circuit court judge decision related to zoning, it's usually gotten overturned because they make some interesting. Their reasoning behind their decisions is often quite interesting. And the Court of Appeals judges are like, no. So that's all I've got. I'm here at the city of Southfield. You can always contact me through the department at any time. I got my contact information on here. Email is usually best for me just because it follows me wherever I go. And yeah, it was like I said, hasn't turned out to not be really that much of a problem, but we do have a few people who are real passionate about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great presentation, Susie and Tom. Appreciate it. We do have a few questions, kind of following up on your question on legal counsel. For both of you, how involved was your local legal counsel prior to actually moving into this? Specifically, were they weighing in on the legality of that ordinance, or were you given any red flags relative to its potential issues? Susie, in your case, and Tom, if you can elaborate on how you brought in your legal.
I would say for us, no, I mean, there was not, other than the fact that punctuation is your friend when you write an ordinance, general code or zoning. And clearly that section that got thrown out needed a little bit more punctuation. There was no real red flags, right? In terms of whether or not we thought that ordinance was valid or invalid, right? So when that came up though, as and I will say, like, even when the ZBA was talking about that, because that was obviously the crux of the case, is, I mean, they did not, they really went through that process, and really talked it out and thought it out during that meeting. It wasn't until circuit court said, nah, try again, that legal counsel bowed out. He was like, nope, I'm out. And we had to find separate counsel.
Okay.
Yeah, in my case, anytime there's an ordinance amendment, the city attorney has to review the language. Yeah. And especially like planning, I ended up drafting it, the initial draft, but like the city attorney went through and looked at the definition. She did some legal review of current case law and state law, and she tweaked those definitions a little bit and tightened them up. We went back and forth on that, but also, like, once you move into the general ordinance stuff, generally those general ordinance amendments are brought forward by the legal department. We bring forward, because it comes from the planning commission, the zoning amendments to council. Mm-hmm. So I had to work with the city attorney just to get anytime there's a general code amendment, the city attorney is the one that brings it forward to council. So you always end up talking to the city attorney on that. But I have her review zoning amendments too, just because she's interested. And it's generally like, has the city attorney looked at this? Is usually a question that comes out at some point. So you want to say yes.
Yeah.
And then, like, involving the clerk's office, the building department, code enforcement, animal, that was just about, like, once again, during the dialogue at the planning commission and the council, there were questions of like, okay, well, what does the animal warden say about this? Have they looked at it? What are we going to do in terms of permitting for the building department? Is it going to have like a shed permit? These are all things we wanted to nail down, so we'd have it all kind of squared up by the time we ended up with an adopted ordinance. And, it pays off because you're not chasing your tail at the end, but it's a lot of work up front to coordinate that and get it all integrated. And then like I said, I'm getting multiple revisions every time I go to planning commission council. But it got refined pretty well. My own feeling is we probably went a little rules heavy. Like, my initial ordinance was a little rules lighter on my backyard fowl, but in order to get it through and to make the electeds comfortable, there had to be a few more rules in there.
Okay.
And sometimes, and that's frequently the case. I usually start out a little rules later, knowing that rules are going to get added
Okay.
as you go through the process.
All right. Next question is during the process, um, did you address disease prevention and disease spread among the animals, i.e., bird flu? And has there been any noticeable increase in enforcement around rats since they've been legalized?
Well, the animal wardens are in contact, as I mentioned, with the state of Michigan Department of Agriculture and get alerts and report back. Like if they find wild birds that are sick and dead, they report that to the Department of Agriculture's ed because a lot of the bird flu is actually propagating in Michigan through the wild population, not through chickens. So they're keeping an eye on that, and they felt confident they could monitor that as they do with the wild population when they're out there seeing animals sick or dying. So with that, and then the rat issue, we have not had any problems with that. The folks who have the permits and are maintaining their coops correctly are not having any rodent issues.
Okay. Susie?
Yeah, we have not had we did, it was a point of discussion during all of our subcommittee meetings and council meetings. That was a discussion, making sure that the birds and the flocks remained healthy. There's nothing formal in the ordinance about it. And at least at this point, it has not been an issue. And neither have the rats actually. Most of these coops are nowhere near our super tiny commercial districts, so that's a bonus for us, right? I know where we do have a couple of little rat issues, and these are nowhere close to those. So far so good.
Okay. Next question. Our village does not have a specific allowance or prohibition on chickens in the ordinance. Some time ago, our former city attorney advised that omission equals prohibition. Is that correct, or could that be considered constitutionally vague? So I think what they're saying is it's not in the ordinance and therefore it's prohibited.
So that was a big point for us, because we've kind of applied that as well, right? Like it's not if it's not in the zoning, you can't do it from a land use perspective, right? And that's kind of what the community was leaning into with that original ordinance language about the keeping of farm animals, right? And so there was a lot of, I mean, that's been one of Chicken Lady's continuous refrains, right? Well, it's not in the ordinance, so I'm allowed to do it because chickens are allowed by the state of Michigan, yada, 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 yada. And I do think that level of unclearness does lend itself to that constitutionally vague sort of determination, right? Um, because in the animal ordinance before we amended it, you could only have cats, dogs, and horses if they were kept on a clay floor. Like, what is that even? What? So, and there was no other standards around it. So, I I would say that's a pretty slippery slope, and you might want to involve your legal counsel to make sure that you have a solid understanding of what is and is not allowed. We did do a lot of research into the generally acceptable agricultural management practices, and there is those are the GAMPs, right?
Mhm.
And there is information about site selection for chickens and for other animals. So um, that would be a good resource to start looking through to see whether or not you even have properties that might be suitable per the GAMPs at the state.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah, I would say in terms of Michigan, I'm a certified zoning administrator through MSU, and one of the things with that training was like Michigan is a strong landowner rights state. When there's lack of clarity in the ordinance, tie goes to the free use of property by the property owner in court usually. So if you have no language on it, you're in a dubious position. I wouldn't rely on that if your intention is to limit them in any way. I would go ahead and think about adopting some language.
Mm.
Um, just that's always in Michigan, like with vague provisions of the code, you will do find that the tie does usually go to the property owner. You need to be clear
Okay.
on that, or at least you need to have consistent interpretations you're applying over time. You need to be documenting those. That would be my primary take home on that one. I wouldn't rely on that just working out because it's not covered by the ordinance.
Okay.
Especially if you're in a community that might be more rural in nature, they might consider keeping chickens to be more of a customary, incidental, accessory activity.
Mhm.
So that would be my concern there.
Okay. General law ordinance versus zoning ordinance. Can you speak to the pros and cons and why you both went the route you did?
Uh, well, there was similar to that to the last question, right? Like the level of how clear do we want to be? It didn't seem to make sense for us to leave it in the zoning ordinance. There was a desire to keep it clean in a way that animals are all addressed in one section, instead of having to go, all right, well, I'm gonna go look over here and then I'm gonna look over here and then see where these all meet together or don't meet together. And so one of the directives from council was, you know, look at what other communities are doing. We want to do it in a smart way that makes sense, that is incredibly clear, and people aren't confused by one section and then led to another. So that was, one of the reasons why we went with the general code, and just keeping it kind of simple from that perspective. Um, the and we didn't want to have to go through the whole zoning amendment process, right? Um, Particularly because we were under the gun from the moratorium, right? It was a 6 month moratorium, and my planning commission and council they have a tendency to table a lot of different kinds of action, whether or not it's backyard chickens or fences or, other minor amendments. So we wanted to make sure that they kept the process moving along and it didn't get stalled out like it did the last time, right? Like they did a lot of work for the last or for the first drafting of the ordinance back in 2020. So and then it just got dropped. So we wanted to make sure that they actually followed through, and kept that process going.
Okay. Tom?
Similar to Susie, but part of that's my own philosophy about zoning ordinances. Like zoning ordinances are good developing like rules for like developing land or what goes on land or where it is and how big it is. But the council wanted rules on how it operated.
Mhm.
So since we were going to, which then moved us into doing a licensing situation, because that's licensing ordinances are annual. They're more about operational characteristics. So all of our other animal regulations were in that, and we had regulations related to chickens in both, which was a little awkward. So we decided since we were going to be doing, we didn't really want to grant a permanent land use approval for this. We wanted an annual permit that could be not renewed or revoked if there were problems. Moving it out of zoning and into a general ordinance and providing for annual license or permit renewal through the clerk was a better way to keep a handle on that and not make, with the zoning approval, you could make a single mistake and you could have to live with it for a long time until that goes away. So that was really, I think the motivation was to provide a kind of a tighter control on it and to have those operational rules, not just the dimensional rules about like where could the coop be, where could the run be, how big can it be. They also wanted to have rules about keeping of the feed and numbers of chickens, all those things, which were kind of more operational characteristics, and that I find generally operates better in a licensing ordinance. So
Okay.
that was kind of how we separated that out.
Excellent. Thank you. I have no more questions. Ryan?
Yeah, thank you both Susie and Thomas for joining us today, for your insights, expertise, great presentations. I also want to thank everyone else for joining today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next planners gathering on August 28th for a presentation on Oakland County's master plan and rezoning review process. So again, thanks for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.